All right. Good evening. Another 8 p.m., another Monday, another quick bites with HR Bites. And come to think of it, I was just reflecting over the weekend. This journey has really come a long way from what started off as just like that, a podcast during COVID times, to a little bit more structured format, keeping the essence alive. Quick Bites with HR Bites was born. We started off in the LinkedIn audio format, and then, like luck would have it, LinkedIn decided to discontinue the audio format, and we were forced to get into the video format. We were forced to drop our pajamas, we were forced to buy some lights, and we were forced to do something different. But like they say, all good things happen when they have to happen. And today, I have another guest who I take the privilege of calling my mentor, another guest who is a mentor to not just hundreds of people, but thousands of people. And I have heard so many stories from so many people about my guest tonight that I felt that this is the right time for Quick Bites with HR Bites to invite my guest tonight. I see many people have logged in live as well. So good evening to everybody who's logged in from the India time zone, people who logged in from different parts of the world. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you've logged in. Love to know where you've logged in from. So do let us know in the comments section, which part of the world have you logged in from? Which city have you logged in from? Coming back, my guest tonight is someone who is a master storyteller. The first time I had the opportunity to hear him live, he was someone who was actually a little bit behind the podium, and I was struggling to see him. But all that it take was the first couple of sentences to get me completely hooked on. Over a period of time, we started joking with each other that we are the long and short of HR. And without further ado and without further suspense, I have absolute pleasure on bringing on live tonight SV Nathan. Nathan, a very, very warm welcome. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be on Quick Bites with HR Bites.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And just for all the listeners today, Sahil is a very tall man, and by comparison, I'm kind of a short guy. So if I stand next to him, I would just tell the world that that's the long and short of HR. He's a delightfully wonderful gentleman to know and speak with, and I'm so happy to see that he's able to put together something not just in fits and starts, but over a steady stream for several years. Post-COVID, that has not deterred him from saying, okay, then now that's over. Now, I mean, I think you got to shut shop. No, he just continued with that. I'd love to stay connected with people who work with a certain purpose. So, Sahil, thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And I was thinking whether I should have you as my first guest on the podcast, but I said no. It's important to save the best when you reach a certain level of maturity, because that's when the audience also comes together and starts appreciating. And as you and I were talking, I think we couldn't have thought of a better topic than the relevance and importance of storytelling. And while the world, of course, knows Nathan, and you're so popular with your office truths hashtag, and every morning, 6 o'clock, I know people who actually take their phone to the washroom to see your update first thing in the morning. But truly speaking, Nathan, let's put the spotlight on you. While you're a master storyteller and HR often asks this question, tell me a little bit about yourself. If Nathan had to say a little bit about himself to the world that didn't know him, of course, everyone knows you, but if you're meeting a stranger for the first time and someone asked you, Nathan, tell me a little bit about yourself, what would Nathan say in his typical storytelling style?
I'm just Sahil. Thank you for asking. I'm just a journeyman. I love life. I love a challenge. I'm inspired by people who work with a sense of purpose, as I do mine. And I love looking at happiness in very, very small bites. So happiness to me is always in the moment. And I've been in the field of human resources for a fairly long time, almost 40 years. And I must say, I came into this quite by accident. I wanted to be an engineer, and and then something happened. By the way, I had enough marks so to enter the great portals of engineering. Unfortunately, my father could not afford me in one particular state, and then we had to move down south. And then something happened, and they said, "Look, you're a tad too late, but when you come next year, this seat is reserved for you." And my father said, "Look, you cannot go back to Maharashtra, Nagpur, where I was studying in Nagpur." And my father said, "Look, I can't afford you there, so you'd be a boarder, and the best is you take some other course." And then I bumbled into mathematics. Did I like mathematics? No. Mathematics was the last thing that I wanted on my plate. But I took mathematics. Did I do well in mathematics? I did very well. I was, at the end of the year, at the end of 3 years, actually, as I got my degree, I was also the best outgoing student of a very prestigious college in Madras, Vivekananda College. And then did I want to move into human resources? Certainly not. I wanted to be in business management. I think I ticked the wrong box. But serendipity, be that as it may, I feel very privileged. For somebody who comes into a subject which is so vast and there's so much to learn on an everyday basis, I just feel like a child waking up every day to learn about a lot of things that people have done, and very inspired by small things, the big things that people do. When Sunita Williams came back along with her partner there from the from outer space, that they were kind of lost, and then they came back, and almost like, of course, there's a process that she gets into as a reentry, and many a time these stories inspire me. And every time I see this, I say, okay, so that's what happens. Having tremendous faith in life, I never knew that I was even going to come to this position in my life. And so I'm very grateful to life, grateful to my friends, to all my teachers, mentors. I would also say a very big thank you to a driver that I met about almost 39 years ago. I owe a lot to that driver because he gave me a piece of advice that I've always followed to date. So life is very interesting. And every day, the fun is in watching all the patterns, whether this happens around you or that happens around the world, Sahil. It is so beautiful. And then, of course, everything is not hunky dory. There's always these pushes, dhakkas, you get plastered. And then you pick yourself up again and you say, okay, we'll now walk some more. So that's what I am. I'm a bit of an athlete at one end. I'm a bit of I love reading, writing. I watch a lot of movies. I live in the moment. And to me, as I mentioned earlier, joy is in the smallest of things. And so that's a little bit about me. And I love sharing stories. I once did a TED talk on stories as well. And I just think the world is a place full of untold stories. And the only thing that we should be doing is trying to unearth it from a lot of people. So that's me.
Beautiful, beautiful. When a phenomena calls himself a journey, just like Nathan did right now, it just is such a beautiful lesson in humility. And I think, Nathan, what would you tell someone like me whose age is lesser than your work experience? And I'm actually feeling very nervous right now. So if you had to tell me a story that would distract me a little and make me a little bit more comfortable, what would that story be?
So I'll share something about this driver.
Sure.
I'll share about this driver. So once I was packed off by my boss. I was then working in an explosives plant somewhere in Bihar. and that was several years ago. I have a reputation that if I stay in a state for more than 8 years, the state splits. And I stayed in that very small place called Gomia, and I stayed there um, for for 8 years. The state split. I then much later came to Hyderabad. More than 8 years, Hyderabad split into Andhra, but back again. So now my friends in Bangalore are now telling me, listen, I don't want you to stay in this place for more than 8 years. Go someplace else. This I was supposed to get off and meet an administrative officer of the government of India in a place called Ranchi. Ranchi is now a very famous place over to Mr. Dhoni, our wonderful cricketer. But in those days, Ranchi was a great place because it was at least about some 50 times bigger than the small town that I was coming in from. And we had to go through very dusty roads, Sahil. And therefore, even if you take any car, by the time it reaches Ranchi, it'll be full of dust and grime. And when you come back, it's the same story all over again. 7 o'clock, the driver arrives at my apartment, and I walk down, and what do I see? This guy has got a piece of cloth, and he's not cleaning the car, he's burnishing the car. He is shining it to a fault. And it's a black-colored ambassador of those good old days, and he was burnishing it. And I looked at him and I said, Jadavji, why are you doing this? Because in any case, it's going to be full of dust. So, and then he looked at me, he said to me in Hindi, which says, Sahib, kaam kari to sahi sahi kari, which loosely translated is, if I have to do a job, I might as well do a good job of it. And the way I read this was, if I have to do a job, howsoever big or small, I must do an outstanding job, regardless of what happens later. So even if I have to clean a car, I would almost make sure that the car is full and shiny. And that happened very early in my life. And I'm always thankful to Ramlal Yadav, because Ramlal Yadav was easily one of my early teachers. And so Sahil, it's not about the age. Whether you're young, whether you're old, you can learn from everyone. Every single person has something to offer, provided you choose to look at it that way.
Beautiful.
So that's my story.
And that's so true. That's so true, Nathan, that age is nowhere a constraint. In fact, the constraint is in the mind. We see a lot of people who become rigid as teenagers, and we see a lot of people in their 80s and 90s are embracing newer technologies and going to their grandchildren to say, teach me how this works because I want to learn it. So I completely agree with you.
Sure.
Nathan, we spoke about this topic called relevance of storytelling. I think each one of us, and I would love to invite the audience here to tell us on the chat, which story from your childhood do you still remember the most and who told you that story? But Nathan, as our audience also engages with us, the age of storytelling has been since our parents, our grandparents, generations after generations after generations. But only for the last decade or so, we've seen that this has got so hyped up in the corporate world, saying that stories are more effective, they evoke emotions, people don't remember data, and the narratives. Why do you think it took so long for the corporate world to understand that जो दादी या नानी की कहानी है वो बच्चा 40, 50, 60 साल भी हो जाता है तो उसको याद रहता है? A child, when he's 4 or 5, listens to a story and remembers it till he becomes a father or a grandfather, or she becomes a grandmother. But corporate India used to just play with data, with PowerPoints, till they realized that the best leaders are the ones who connect with people through stories. What took so long, Nathan?
I don't think I'll blame the corporate world. I think we just aped the West in some ways. And one day we realized that we have a story to share. And maybe that's when we started. The day you start to become yourself is the day when you'll you will really share your own story. And I discovered the power of storytelling quite some time ago. So much so that even when I had to um, make a presentation to become a partner in the firm, I I decided that the best thing to do is is to evoke some interest. And if you'll permit me, I will share that with you. So
Please.
one day, um, you know, you have to get on deck. On deck in these professional services firm means, I mean, then you qualify to get to the final. The final round is again with a set of partners, and they would. So you have to say what's your unique selling proposition? What's your value proposition? And I had a ton of things, and I knew that everybody, his uncle and aunt, would come and say the same thing. They would say, "I'm great. This is what I'm doing. These are my skills. I carry with me, 10 lines of qualifications." And I was wondering, I'm just going to get lost. And for the number of people that they view every day, that day it just so happened that my turn would be in the afternoon around 4:30, which mine must be the last or the penultimate one. In 15 minutes, I have to just make sure that these people get an idea about who I am. And so what I did was, much against everybody's wishes, I just inserted a picture of Tanjore painting. And the Tanjore painting is a very nice one. It's of a certain kind, and and I inserted that in my slides very early. And I started my pitch by saying, "My name is so and so, and I'm here to present my credentials. And even as I start, this is what I have to share with you." And then I put up the picture, a fantastic, beautiful Tanjore painting. And I said, "This is the very reason I am who I am." But I'm going to come to that in a moment. And then I went on to the next slide. And then I mentioned, well, the previous slide, there's a story to it. I'll come back to it. And people forgot all what I was going to say because they're all waiting at the edge of the seat, wondering what that story is. And then I said, well, in conclusion, and somebody said, "What about the story?" I said, "In conclusion, hold on. This is what the story is." So this is a picture of a Tanjore painting. It's a very valuable painting because it's all gilt edge and all that. But more importantly, this is very valuable because it has come to me as an heirloom, and my father gave it to me, and he got it from his father, my grandfather. My grandfather was a musician, a person of very meager means, and he had been to the city called Tanjore, and it's a very small town, quaint town down south in Tamil Nadu. And he went up to this lovely shop, which had a lot of painting, and he said, "I'd like to have this painting." He says, "Well, if you have to have this painting, you should have 30 rupees with you." Now, loosely translated, that will be the equivalent of about some 3 lakh rupees. My, my grandfather didn't have that kind of money. And he said, "Look, I don't have anything to give you. Can you not negotiate?" "No, no, I don't have money, but I want this painting." So I said, "What can you give me?" He said, "I can give you my music." And so the shopkeeper said, "Hold on." And then he said, "Come back at 4 o'clock." At 4 o'clock, he had put out a nice shamiana, put a lot of chairs, invited a lot of people from that town, and my grandfather started singing. One song, second, the third, and he sang for almost 2 hours, and the entire crowd was in raptures because it was so gripping, it was so ethereal listening to my grandfather. And the shopkeeper went inside and he got that painting and he gave it to my grandfather. And I said, "That's my story." What it says is, you're meeting somebody who values what he wants, and you will find that he will leave no stone unturned till he gets to what the goal is. And that sums up what the painting is, and that's why it's very precious for me. This is who I am. I said this and I walked away. And they asked me a couple of questions. I don't think they really asked me a number of questions, but the thing was, much later in the evening, when my boss came to me and he was in the shadows, you're not supposed to be in the room. He put his arms around me and he says, "Oh, that was just fantastic." And I said, "But what about all my credentials?" All credentials were pushed to the side because people wanted to hear stories. I remember this happened almost 20 years ago. And I did not lose sight of that. Of course, there are good reasons why stories sell. So in any presentation, if you have data, that data will tell you a story. Anything that you have around you is all about stories, because you can have sheaves of paper. You have a 70-page deck, but you have to condense it to just about 3 minutes. You can really look at what is the pattern and what's a suitable story that goes with it. So stories are 22 times more powerful than a presentation slide, is what I was told years ago. I can see this in action. So that's a little bit about storytelling. It's relevant. People have discovered it. Whether it's the story of the hare and the rabbit that somebody put up as one of the comments out there, I said very true. Lot of stories, lots of stories, and all of them can really come up, and that's what it is. The hare and the tortoise. Yes, Rajeshri, thank you.
Absolutely, Nathan. So, Nathan, a 15-minute conversation through that one picture was like amazing, because people wanted to hear your story of what that story was behind the picture. But if there's something slightly more longish, let's say there is a job description, or there is a role, or there is a job that you need to sell to a prospective candidate who you've been headhunting, and you've been doing this for a very, very long time in your career in the various roles that you played. How does one leverage storytelling to attract the right talent?
Sahil, I think it starts with a certain purpose. If you really wanted somebody to come and join you because of a job description, forget it. I don't think people join organizations because there's a lovely job description, or there are 30 pieces of silver more than what others can afford. No. I think people join organizations because they'd like to hear about what is the purpose of the organization, what is it that the role can do to the organization, and how you can really change and transform both lives of just not yourself, but for people who are around you. So much of conversations, if that were more about what potentialities hold in the person that can be unleashed in a canvas which is wide open for them to paint on, that's what people would want to talk to. They'd get more interested in what is it that they can do, what they can do to contribute. So I think if I were to get a person in any part, I think, for example, if I have to get somebody as a recruiting leader, then I think the whole thing is about, would you want to change the culture of this organization into, or would you want to make a mark on an organization which is wanting to grow, and it can grow only on the back of people who can get outstanding talent, such as your goods. You need to give a sense of value of what they can do for the job and what the job itself entails, instead of telling them, well, this one, you need to do this, you need to do that, and all that, because, well, every job description will talk about what the job entails. So that's what I'd say. I think if you give people a sense of what they can do, that itself can get people very inspired.
Super. And while we've looked at this from an organization or an employer point of view, what do you think are some of the pitfalls that candidates need to be mindful of, or employees like yourself, and you mentioned you went for that discussion, whether it's candidates or employees, what are some of the pitfalls they should be mindful of when they are talking about their stories? So what are some of the don'ts when you go about storytelling from a candidate or an employee point of view?
So I think it's important to observe your audience. It's very important. If your story does not capture the imagination of the person sitting out there, I think it's wasted efforts. I think you should move on. What would people want to hear about? I think it's important to understand your audience first. You must understand what your story is and whether there would be sustained interest in that story. And the pitfall that we have is sometimes we get so lost in our story, we just do not know. So, okay, this is a great story, but how does it come back and fit with the overall discussions that one is having? I think that's a pitfall. If you don't come back to where you started, and if you're not able to make the connection or the connectedness between what you have as a story and what you would like people to know, that could be a pitfall. Another one is if you spend too much time on the story but leave the rest of it. A story is good, but then there are other things which are part of the narrative. Never forget the narrative. The narrative is important. The stories gets it to get a little bit of a fillip up there. So don't ever forget the overall purpose, the overall reason why you're there in that room. I think that should never be forgotten. Those are the kind of 2 or 3 pitfalls that I would caution people against.
Bang on. And I think that we've seen this many a times where leaders get very swayed by the story that they are saying and they get so carried away. At times, you also realize that maybe this part of the story is turning fictitious because they
Yes.
just get so carried away. So, how does one balance authenticity, strategy, narrative in storytelling? Because, as you rightly said, the story is one part of it, but the second part is connecting the dots and what's the kind of narrative that you want to send to your audience. How does one find a balance between all of this? Is there a particular trick in the book that has worked for you? Is it your style? Is it authenticity, strategy, narrative, balance?
I think it's a mix of all these all these things. I think if you're just being yourself, and people must be able to relate with your story, and they will know whether it's something that is fictitious, that is made up, because they are looking at you in the eye, and whatever that you have, this non-verbal stuff that happens around you is the one that people watch out for. Just being yourself, being your authentic self, goes a very long way. You can't spin stories with people who have heard many a tale. So just be yourself, and they'll know by the tenor and the tone and the conviction with which these stories are being shared. That is all that matters. And again, I believe in the proportionality. I mean, so I hope your story is not so big that you forget the rest of it. And how do you then make the connections, dot the I's, cross the T's? And there are various ways of telling stories, and there's a method in all that, but I won't bore you with that.
Sure. Nathan, I think two things very clearly stand out for me when I go back to the times when I would be in the audience listening to you sharing stories, whether it's at a keynote speech or an opening event, whatever. One, I think, was the way you modulated your voice, right? And the way you really brought in modalities, enunciations in the manner in which the story would take a turn. No one knew what's coming up next, right? And the beauty with you was you never repeated your stories. I've heard you in various forums, whether it's NHRDN or FICCI or CII or SHRM. You've never really repeated your story. So even though a person would have heard you multiple times, every time it was a new story. And second, I think it's not just the tonality, but also the manner in which you connected the dots and brought across the learnings from that story, which left many of us with a profound impact. So you want to tell us a little bit more of how do you create these mic drop moments and how do you modulate voice to really get people to feel you're on that blind curve, but you have a secure driver navigating you through these wonderful, treacherous roads?
So much later, and I'll keep you honest. I have heard a lot of stories from my grandmother. The greatest storyteller in my life is my grandmother, and to me, she's the reason why I'm talking to you today. And you share these stories because they have made a big change to you in your life. My grandmother was a okay. Why am I talking about my grandmother? Let me talk about an old lady. Huh? Some different old lady. Okay. So there's an old lady who used to gather a lot of children on the sidewalk, the platform of a house where she lived in a room with 14 people, kids, adults, just one small room about some 12 feet by 10, where they didn't have a door, but they just had a privacy curtain made of jute bags, which are sewn together. So that's all that they had. There was a common bathroom, and people woke up early in the morning just to make sure that they are first in the line for the morning jobs. So she lived in a place which was, and by the way, she had only one leg. And this old woman was very inspiring because every day in the evening, and being a family of modest means, they used to have a meal in the morning, one in the evening. The children went to the common, public school, corporation school, and not and the corporation school is another story. But children used to mill around her in the evening in her living room. The living room was really the platform or the sidewalk, as we call these days. And this was on the road, cars passing, cycles, and people walking by, and she would be sharing stories. And a lot of young children used to come around, and one day, as she was narrating her stories, and she was passing on a small bowl of curd rice around to people who were interested in her stories, one little boy got distracted and was not listening to her, but was looking somewhere else. And this old lady was very upset, and she slapped the boy and she said, "I'm talking to you and you're not listening to me." And the child suddenly had tears in his eyes, and the child says, "Grandma, I'm really sorry, but I saw a car go by, a black colored car, all very shiny, and I got distracted by that car." So he says, "What about that car?" So he says, "Grandma, can I ever sit in that car? Can I ever in my life sit in that car?" Now, remember, the children who were around were all people from very modest means. I mean, so for them, this is all like a huge dream. And the grandma looks at the child and says, "Hey, child, if you have to sit in a car, make sure that you drive the car and the car must be yours. Or you must be the person sitting behind, and there must be a driver, and you must be paying his salary, and the car must be yours." Now, this is too much for the child to take, and says, "Grandma, can I ever get to that stage?" And the granny then closes off by saying, "Of course, child, you can. The only thing that you got to do is study a little bit harder. Just try a little bit harder. Just try a little bit harder." That's a story. I remember the story every day as I set out to work, because that old lady who was so very inspiring and really got a child to be all charged up was a person that the child values very much. And today, the very same child is speaking to you. That old lady was my grandmother, and I was a boy who got slapped. I was a boy who got slapped. That's a story.
Brilliant. Nathan, this was like show it to me and here it is. The voice modulation, A great connect, and I think we all love that story. Everybody in the comments, let us know whether you liked the story. But Nathan, I think one of the most important aspects is how do you get your audience to visualize? How do you get your audience to be in that moment? Like, for example, when you were sharing the story, I actually felt that even I was sitting there, I could picturize the jute bags, I could picturize the sound of the traffic, and I could transpose myself as sitting next to Nathan in that small 10 by 10 room, listening to that story, not listening on a streaming platform with you and I doing this 800 kilometers apart. How does one transpose
So,
people from where they are today into the story?
I recently ran a workshop on storytelling, and very much like you, Sahil, you need to know the technology. So I was thinking, what am I going to talk about a technology? Because for me, this seems almost easy. But then if somebody were to practice this and put some structure around it, so it goes by the structure of the 3 Ds. One is there is a lot of detail in it. So one is details. The second one is a dialogue. So if you remember my grandmother speaking to the child speaking to the grandmother. So then slowly you start to picturize all that. And the third one is drama. So a story needs to have these 3 Ds. But more importantly, in sharing a story, there is always something called the takeoff, then there is a turbulence, and then there is a touchdown. So there are the 3 T's of a story, which is the takeoff, the turbulence, and the touchdown. So, well, these are let's say some hacks around it, some ways of putting it. But I'll tell you what really works. Each of us, we have our own styles, and as long as you stick to what you think is the way which will work for you, be my guest. I think that's more important. Being authentic, being yourself. People share stories in different ways. And all we need to do is you say, okay, forget all these forms and formats. I've got to tell it the way it is. And if it comes from here, um, you know, between the third and the seventh rib on your left, the heart, I think you're good. That's what it is.
Absolutely. The space between the third and the seventh rib is all that matters. But
Sure.
Nathan, as you were calling the story out, there was a part of me that was loving it, but there was a part of me that was also very hurt. And the reason why a part of me was very hurt is because I had heard another HR professional in another forum say the same story as their story. And this person is far, far more younger. And that just for a moment came and hit me to say that maybe he would have heard this story from you somewhere. And when he went into a different forum, he went and said exactly the same story. Of course, not in your style, with the detailing was the same as his own story. So, how does one really look at authenticity of stories? Because the
Don't
hair is
don't
not
worry
a
about
story.
don't worry about all these things. For all you know,
Hmm,
he may have had a very similar life. It can happen.
got it.
The moment you start to bisect it and try saying, hey, he said the same thing, he said who do you think is? No, no. I don't think there are certain versions of the truth. If that is his truth, that is the truth. This is
Beautiful.
my reality. In fact, I penned down all these stories and put them into a book called The Heart of Work. And you'll find that I'm not sure that I wrote this particular one in that book, but really anything which seems kind of even remotely similar, it's okay. It's okay. Maybe for all you know that the person went through that same life. So why deny it? By the way, I want to share this with you. Although you say Aesop's fables, there are no copyrights by Aesop. So the hare and the tortoise, they have the same story. everything is the same. But I don't think you have some publisher coming after you and saying, that's my story. How dare you? If somebody, I would just say it is. I'm sure there must be lots of people like us, and so I won't think too much about it.
Brilliant. But I think that's the Nathan in you that says, I won't think too much about it. I have seen people on the other end of the spectrum who also, when it comes to their work, not stories, but when it comes to their work or it comes to what they have done differently, they get very agitated, very upset, and then their narrative also changes towards the individual, not to the individual, but about the individual. How does one manage that kind of story? The perception, which is not the reality, but the tale of the town, the gossip that goes around, because in someone's head, they may not go and tell the individual that, hey, did you have a similar situation like mine and therefore your story sounds similar? Instead of doing that, they rather form the perception saying, oh, he copied my story. And then they go all around town telling people, hey, he's a copycat. How does one manage that story? Because not everybody is Nathan. Let's accept it.
Just ignore it and walk by. There are better battles to fight, and I don't think you should quarrel with any of this. If that is their life, so be it, and just walk over. I mean, it's a large, beautiful world there. Why do you have to quarrel about this is my story? That is, by the way, there are no copyrights on stories. No copyrights. An autobiography is personal to an individual. If it so happens the other person walked on the same path, you can't deny that person that. I think the grace is just walking by. And whether it's me or anybody else, that's what we should do to address it.
All right. I think Pankaj has something very nice to say about you, Nathan. And that's also to do with the zing in the story that you bring in. So thank you, Pankaj, for calling that out. That's brilliant. I'm also going to read a couple of more comments. Rukmani has a slightly longer one, so let's bring that up. Although it's going to cover our faces, but that's all right. What makes Nathan stand apart is his unwavering belief in people. He doesn't just mentor with advice, he mentors with belief. There were moments when she doubted her path, but Nathan's quiet confidence in her potential often became the turning point. I love the last line as I read it out loud. He didn't tell me what to do. He empowered me to discover it myself. Wow.
So both Pankaj and Rukmani, thank you so much. Both these people are good friends and they would always say good things. So thank you very much. You've been very, very generous. Pankaj has been a friend for God knows, so many years. He's a wonderful gentleman. And Rukmani, who has written those piece, a wonderful lady. And how nice it is to see people doing well. I'm very, very happy to hear what you're doing and how you're doing it. Very grateful. Very grateful. Thank you.
Super. Nathan, whenever I met you, you always had a story to share. Of course, this would come with a lot of observation. This would come with a fetish for stories, so on and so forth. But we also have a question. I'm going to bring it up on the screen by Arvind that says, how does one create a bank of stories so that one doesn't repeat it? And if I may extend the question, how does one know from the pitara of stories which story to pick up when? Any kind of thoughts on that, Nathan?
Arvind, you ask a very, very good question. I believe that if it's a very good question, I can respond to it. If it's an outstanding question, I will say it's an outstanding question. I will turn it over to Sahil to respond. But to get to the answer, you may not believe it, but Arvind, I collect stories. So I don't have a way of sharing it. This is a new platform. Otherwise, I'm sitting at my computer. I would go into a section which says stories. And then if I click on it, I would have a whole, almost some 80, 90 stories, and I'll keep adding to it. And then now I'm trying to catalog them to say, okay, this is how it is. And I have written the way I do it is after. How do I know which story to pick up? I think if you think very deeply about that particular subject, you would be able to uh, pick up one or two things which are coming close. The best way, of course, is when you know what you have to do, you go, if you have a good ways of either indexing it or cataloging it, then you will find that story. And the most important thing is sometimes it does not even have to be a story that you have been part of. You may have heard that story, but when you hear these stories, give people the credit and say, I heard from Sahil. Pankaj, when I talked to him years ago, this is his story. And talk about that and give people um, the credit for what they have said. And last but not the least, if nothing works, if you don't have a story, here is something for you to consider. Uh, you look at some scientific deeds that have come up. For example, somebody has been in space. This is what is the problem, and 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 then somebody has managed to solve it. Bring that in. I have a story about how one can become a great athlete even if that person is not a sprinter. There are a lot of things. All you have to do is say, okay, you connect all this and say, okay, I think this is what you can do. So you can have, for example, what's the boiling point of water? 100. Now, even if you add more heat to it, it will just get to being it'll just steam itself away. 540 calories and so on. But the thing is, even at the 99 degrees, it's still the water, but it is not boiling. That 1 degree makes a difference. Now you look at this and say, okay, maybe there is something around this. Maybe I should add this. Or you can take any day-to-day incident and as long as you can see a pattern around it, you can bring the pattern to add to your story or to your lines or to whatever that you're sharing in a public forum. I remember once I spoke about the sprinter and the long distance runner and how that made a big difference to me in my life. Now, don't ask me how I'm going to connect all this. I'm not going to share one more story. But there's a lot of, oh no, I mean, I don't want you to think that every conversation is getting to be a story, but as long as you're able to collect these stories, salt them away, think about them, and then I always have my mobile. It would have loads of stories that I've cataloged. And if I read a story which is very inspiring, I would salt it away. I'm so very, very grateful to technology because now it obviates the need for me to keep writing it down, collecting them, putting them in one place. And even if I'm not at home and suddenly something happens, I now have this because it'll be able to tell me a lot of things because I've now put them in certain corners and you can bring it to light. So facts, everyday facts that you see, that can become a story. Back to you.
Sure. Sure. Thanks, Nathan. Many a times introverted people, and I know introverted has a lot to do with focus on where you gain your energy from, but people who generally talk less, or people who find it difficult to build rapport, or people who find it difficult to do small talk. What would you give them as some tips and tricks to build conversation rather than just saying, how is the weather? How was your day? What have you done so far? Which is very done and dusted. What's the great way for someone who finds it difficult to walk up to a stranger to just introduce themselves or break the awkward silence? What's that one story from your catalog that you'd love to share?
You may not believe it. I was an introvert. Sometimes I still think I'm an introvert. What you do in your job could be very different from the role. What you do in a role very different from the person that you are. All of us have our quiet moments. I'd enjoy silence. I like to be by myself. I'll be happy being all by myself the whole day. It's okay. Or I could be in the company of interesting friends and then spend the whole day. That's also fine. And I think the whole deal is about um, what makes you more comfortable. The reason why I turned to stories is um, people had a lot to brag about what they have done. I had nothing to brag about. The only thing I could share was, hey, did you hear about this? And I would share a story. And over a period of time, that became to be rather interesting. And people would say, hey, what do you think? And suddenly I found that there was an audience for it. And then I started collecting these stories. And then things grew. Then I grew a little more confident about myself, Sahil. And many times I ask myself, is this the right story? And what will people think of me? When people share stories, the greatest fear is the fear of getting judged. And the other one
Sure.
is my story good enough? And that's when people start to put in all these extra frills, not required, not needed. I discovered myself one day when I was just myself. The year was 1991, and I used to feel a tremendous sense of pathos because there's a lot happening in my life. Forget what that data is, and I used to feel very compelled. I even wrote a poem. The poem was called "A Land of Two Shadows." I live in a land of two shadows. The one that is to the world, the one which is inside, and I was really grieving inside, and I was just about 8, 9 years old, professional, feeling completely down and beaten. And I went to a set of people, and then suddenly somebody asked me, "What's on your mind?" And I said, "Well, this is that deep sense of pathos which is now taking over me, and this is the reason." And the reason was that my father was an alcoholic, and it disturbed me considerably. I was a young boy then, a young professional, and it hurt me very badly. And in that moment, that person looked at me and said, "So what? Each person has their own tales of woes, but should that bring you down? Or do you want to do something about it? And by the way, it's your life. Do what you want to do with it." And then he walked away. 1991 was a turning point in my life because I got a grip over my life and I said, he's so true. That was my father. That is what he wants to do. It's okay. Why do I get consumed with him? And of course, the hero in my life is my father. So I really took it to heart. And the whole thing is not about what really happens, but in these small moments, you get the urge to say, okay, I'm now going to do something different. All these thresholds are thresholds of growth. My growth mindset at that time got triggered by a person who said, big deal. That's all he said, big deal. Everybody has his own tales of woe and big things, man. Get on, move on with it. That's it. And I moved on. That's the story. I have no idea what your question
Just
was.
2 words, right?
Yes.
No, I'm saying just 2 words, big deal, and led to
Big
something
deal.
which another 2 words, growth mindset. Yeah.
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 Big deal.
I was talking to a friend just before this podcast, and he was telling me about how things were shaping up in his personal life. And he requested me to ask you a question, Nathan. And the question is, since the topic is storytelling, he says, can storytelling save a failing relationship? And I'm sure it's something
So
to do with his life, but without getting into details, maybe he wants to know And I'm sure at times many of us also face that same dilemma of saying, are we authentic? Are we coming across as saying what we mean? Or are we just going round and round? What are your thoughts on any suggestion?
I'll tell you this. Um, every failure is an opportunity to succeed. There is nothing called failure, there are only learnings. If we learn that, well, this didn't work, there'll be something else that will work. And we we need to have something where I call as a deep sense of conviction, because that conviction is the one that really moves the world. Sometimes people clutch at straws. And I will tell you, one time it so happened that I got bored writing the office truths. And every day I have to almost compulsively write. And the way for me is, if I don't feel sufficiently into it, and if I don't feel into my words, because they are always a day-to-day experience. Every day I would go through that experience, something else happens, and I would put them out into lines. One day I stopped. I stopped for almost about 5-6 days, and then I got a message which said, "Why have you stopped?" And in a private window, and I on LinkedIn, and I said, "I stopped because I felt I was less than authentic." He says, "But you're the reason why I'm still alive." I got a shock, and I said, "Seriously?" And I immediately, some things you can't do on these chat windows. Yeah? I just said, "Here is my number if you would care to give me a call." So she called me and she says, "You're the reason why I'm alive today." And I said, "What, you want to share something more?" She said, you remember you wrote something about a week ago or so." And I, I write every day, and not everything is something that I would remember. But then she said, it starts with, "There will be a day." And I said, "Let me complete that for you." I had written, "There will be a day in your life when the yellow river will turn clear and the wheels of fortune will turn in your favor." The wheels of fortune will turn in your favor. This girl was almost wanting to say goodbye to Mother Earth, and she was going to, fall off a tall building. She got a ping, and that was a morning ping, and she saw this, and she said, "Maybe there is something to life." And she says, "Okay, I've got to get and deal with this." And many things happen. She says, "Nathan, did you realize that that is what it meant to me?" And I got a shock. And then she continued by saying, "Sometimes we all go through a lot of stuff in our offices, at home, wherever. And sometimes we clutch at straws. That day, that which I got as a message is the reason why I'm talking to you." And I felt I was shocked, and I thanked her. And as I kept the phone down, I realized um, all we have to do is we have to do what we have to do. You got to do what you got to do. And you keep doing that. I think relationships are always mended. They are never broken. There are so many relationships. I mean, I don't have to go far. Just about 20 days ago, there was a relative in my family, and for some reason, he freaked out on me in public. This is a public gathering of all my relatives in a wedding, and he freaked out on me. And I didn't know what to do. And I could have shouted, and I could have stood my ground, and I said, "Let me come back to you." And I walked out of the place, not in a huff, but very quietly, I just went away. The following day at 7, I went up to him and I said, "I'm so sorry inadvertently if I made a mistake. Kindly pardon me. I'm just another person who doesn't want to be misunderstood. I'm sorry." Things moved dramatically. It's almost like there's a difference. Lighter day, and the person said, forgiving you, you must forgive me." And then we hugged and cried. And Relationships can always be mended, but somebody's got to take the first step. I could have stood my ground and said, oh, heck with it, man. I mean, he shouted at me, he should come to me. What can help relationships or break relationships is this three-letter word called ego. If we can handle our ego, we can handle relationships. Back to you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Nathan, one last question, and I want to come to the most important part of my segment. But everybody shares stories, right? But there are very, very few people who are heard. How do you make people listen to you? Is that the art of the storyteller? Is it the story? Is it the way you go around telling the story? What's the way to make people listen? What's the way to make heads turn?
You're almost making this a technique. I don't want to make this a
We're asking
technique.
you for the cheat code. We're asking for the cheat code that if Nathan writes Office Truths at 6 a.m., how is it at 6:15 a.m. he gets 1,000 likes? That's what we're asking you.
No. I think all of us see it's a shared world. If my world intersects a little bit with your world, then I say, okay, there is a connect, and that's what happens. I think we just have to be we just have to be ourselves, and I think that's what we just got to be ourselves. Kripa has asked a question: how do you let go of a situation as it keeps lingering in our mind and is always in the back of the mind? So Kripa, I'll tell you what worked for me. I don't know whether it's going to work for you. Forgiving somebody is the best way, because when you forgive, you also forget. You move on. It's okay. And by the way, there are some things that you can never change. Don't try to change it. You see if you can change yourself. Being on the planet a little longer, I can tell you, carrying grudges don't count. Don't carry grudges. And don't feel bad why it did not happen to you, where your neighbor is driving a Maserati while you're still struggling with your Alto. Forget it. Both of them travel on the same potholed road. Yeah, what is the big deal?
True. Okay, Nathan, I'm conscious of time, but we have the most interesting part that people really look forward to, which is the rapid fire. Please
Sure.
forgive me because I have not shared these questions with you in advance, and nor have I thought through all the questions. So let's put the spotlight on you, and we want you to keep it very rapid and very fiery, just
Sure.
to us, right?
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, super. What's the worst corporate jargon you've heard disguised as a story?
Can you repeat that?
What's the worst corporate jargon you have heard disguised as a story?
The jargon is, let me put it this way.
Let me put it this way. Okay, lovely. If your career was a movie, what would be the title of the movie?
The long and winding road.
The Long and Winding Road. Brilliant. What's the most boring way someone has ever started a story at work? The most popular way is Once Upon a Time, but what's the most boring way someone's ever started a story?
Let me tell you a brilliant story.
They call it brilliant even before they have started it, even before you called it brilliant. Amazing. Okay. If HR was a Bollywood movie, what would be its genre?
Uh, the genre would be retro.
Retro? Okay.
Retro.
What's more
Yeah.
painful? Yeah, what's more painful? A bad story or a never ending PowerPoint deck?
You know the answer. I would rather take a bad story than a never-ending PowerPoint deck.
Okay, lovely. What's the story that should be banned from all job interviews?
the one line that should be banned, I do not know about the story, is tell me something
One
about
line.
yourself.
Tell me something about yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. What's a short way to make a presentation go viral?
Keep it short. Make it impactful.
Beautiful. If storytelling was a sport, what would be the penalty for a bad story?
A kick in the butt.
No yellow card, no yellow river, a kick in
No
the
yellow
butt.
card. Kick the butt. Yeah. No yellow card.
What's
And
your
call it an
reaction?
accident. Huh?
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I said no yellow cards or red cards. You just kick the person and then show the red card.
Kick the person in the butt and then give the red card. Brilliant.
Yeah.
What's your reaction when someone says, let me tell you a short story, but it goes on and on and on? How do you react to that?
You just stare into space.
Say hi to Sunita Williams.
Yeah. Even she has come down to Mother Earth.
Absolutely. Okay, if you could rewrite an HR policy, in a fun way, which policy would it be and how would you rewrite it? This is a slightly longer one, so you can take some time.
This HR policy would be around leave. Around leave. And I think one of the ways that we should be looking at leave is use it or lose it. And give people the flexibility to choose. I think one of the things that HR we do is we do a lot of over-engineer things like policies. I think if there's one policy I'd like to change, that should be the policy around leave. I think you should leave it just to people's goodness. Yeah, I say, okay, these are the days. That's it, and be open with it. People will not take leave.
Beautiful. Nathan, thank you so much. Like someone mentioned in one of the posts, can we start at 7:30 p.m. and go until midnight? I don't know whether you read that comment. But I truly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for all the love, the entire audience. Thank you for being there. And for those of you who couldn't watch the episode live, it's all going to be available on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. And do watch it. And Nathan, once again, thank you so much for taking time out.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for humoring me. Sahil, thank you for putting this up. Bye-bye. Cheers. Good night.
Thank you.